Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss A Haunting in Venice, starring Kyle Allen, Kenneth Branagh, Camille Cotton, Jamie Dornan, Tina Fey, Jude Hill, Ali Khan, Emma Laird, Kelly Riley, Ricardo Scarmarcio, forgive me if I said that wrong, and Michelle Yeoh, directed by Kenneth Branagh. Now, before I get into this movie, welcome back to Hercule Poirot or Murder on the Orient Express, Agatha Christie stories retrospective. And I did just go back and review, what was it? Appointment with Death recently. Even though I have done the previous ones, there were times that one wasn't available on streaming. But thanks to Tubi, I finally got a chance to watch that thing and review it for the show. So, and I'm now caught up with this one. And the PG 13 rated horror movie, that's going to get on my nerves after a while watching this movie. But let's see how this goes. We open with weird shots like Sideways, which is something Kenneth Branagh has done before when he directed Thor, the first one, I mean, and we get a random shot of a seagull killing a pigeon of some kind, which is a random opener, and we get reintroduced to a retired detective Hercule Poirot, returned by Kenneth Branagh in Venice, Italy in the year 1957, and we get someone who needs help with a family member, and Poirot's assistant knocks him down and tells him he's retired as he works on his garden and has some eggs for breakfast until his old friend, let me see if I'm saying this right, Ariadne Oliver, played by Tina Fey, is a writer of some of Poirot's adventures in books, and she asks him to go to a Halloween party for the children going on at night, and she wants Poirot to help Oliver out with a psychic named Mrs. Reynolds, played by Michelle Yeoh, being some kind of a fraud. I'm not one who believes in psychics, but in general, but Michelle Yeoh plays one quite well in my opinion, and the shots looked funny at times, and that felt a little distracting to me. We get to the Halloween party and we get a scary story about a monster that left the doctors and nurses, and the party starts, and we get introduced to Olga Semenoff, played by Camille Cotton, Rowena Drake, played by Kelly Riley, her stepson Leopold Ferrier, played by Belfast's Jude Hill, her husband Dr. Leslie Ferrier, played by 50 Shades of Grey's Jamie Dornan, and Vitale Portfoglio, played by Ricardo Scaramarcio, forgive me if I said that wrong, and Mrs. Reynolds comes in with Desdemona Holland, played by Emma Laird, while the party is still going on until a haunting in the house comes by, knocking down a house decoration, and they send the kids home as we're told about a daughter named Alicia Drake, or Alicia Drake, let's call her, who died from a suicide as she was seeing things, and some of these scenes are kind of shot kind of dark, and I didn't really care for the movie. It was how the movie was shot because of how dark it was, and unfortunately, this isn't as scary as a PG-13 rated horror movie like A Quiet Place is, for example. We meet Maxime Gerard, played by Kyle Allen, who comes off kind of like a jerky character, and they get around in a circle and try to talk with the dead Alicia with Mrs. Reynolds and says something in a circle, "You killed me," and Poirot spots Nicholas Holland, who's Desdemona's brother and played by Ali Khan, and the chimney, and I'm thinking, what the hell is wrong with her? As she may be the best performance in the movie, as it took me my second viewing for me to realize Rowena, and I'm going to just spoil this now, Rowena killed her by saying mother, and they typed M, and I thought, okay, after seeing this the second time, because I went twice, I had to go see this movie twice for note-taking reasons, it was that obvious, but the first viewing I thought it was so, but my mind was on Oliver, because she was the closest person to the murder, and I'll get there in the next segment. Poirot talks with Mrs. Reynolds as she wishes she was a fraud, and she brings up his dead wife, Catherine, and this will be the last meeting between Poirot and Mrs. Reynolds, as she puts on her uniform on Poirot, which made me think, why does she look silly while walking around in that costume? And he takes the mask off and tries to get the apple while the murderer grabs him and tries to drown him in the water from the apple bowl. Anybody remember those? And Vitale saves Poirot's life and asks for Mrs. Reynolds as she dies, and Oliver screams for her life. And I thought, she's faking it on my first viewing. And my money was on her the whole damn time on my first viewing until I get to the end of the movie. Poirot locks everyone up for the night to question everyone for the night. And Poirot says he is back on the case and makes Oliver his assistant. And first she finds the toy rabbit that Mrs. Reynolds touched earlier in the film. And they start interrogating people, starting with Rowena, as she is clearly, obviously lying her ass off at this point. And on my second viewing, I almost shouted in the theater, she did it. It's that obvious. They interview Olga, as she takes offense to it, but goes with it anyways until Poirot hears voices of a little girl as it goes back and forth in the movie, and it ends there with... And that interrogation was kind of silly, and it reminded me of what is Tina Fey doing in this movie, as she's a comedian, while Vitale says to Maxime he won't get far with a broken leg, which was kind of funny. Poirot interviews Dr. Ferrier, as Dr. Ferrier tells Poirot to not stare at, as he's not a loony, and Poirot almost messes up his line and hears the little girl again, and I thought, I get it. He hears a little girl, as that will be happening again and again. And it gets to the point it gets annoying, as he goes back into the bathroom and sees a ghost of Leopold knocking on the door and wanting to get interviewed while reading Edgar Allan Poe, as he likes him more than Charles Dickens, as he says he is too silly. And his interview is about how jumpy Poirot is, and that was a little tedious. Poirot interviews Desdemona and Nicholas, as Vitale believes they have something to do with her murder. And as Poirot and Oliver interview them, they talk about their home in St. Louis, Missouri, which is, I'm guessing, is where they're from. And Desdemona tries to run out and punches Vitale, and they get tied up, and Poirot hears the little girl once again. And Leopold asks if he heard it, and Vitale finds a phone in a secret place, and he sees the little girl and tried to talk to her, but she's not really there. But it's in Poirot's head, and this movie isn't really scaring me, nor is it making me hold my grip on my seat like A Quiet Place did, for example. They hear a loud noise and go down a tunnel and find things banned. Dr. Ferrier suddenly fights Maxime after beating up his son, and that's not what I'm here for, which is what's throwing me off guard. Dr. Ferrier is locked in a room so that he doesn't have to fight anyone again, and Rowena gives Poirot the key, and then he interviews Maxime and sees her half of the photo, while Poirot picks it up, and we learn he broke off the engagement of marriage as he blames himself for it. And I wasn't buying it, to be quite honest. And we hear the little girl again, and Oliver brings him to a place to breathe some air. Poirot interviews Vitale and almost believes he killed Mrs. Reynolds as well as Alicia. And he was a cop at one point in time, and he's led to believe Oliver killed them as well, because she was hired by Vitale to get Poirot back on the case, and I felt like he was jumping to conclusions. And I just didn't care. Poirot opens the room of Dr. Ferrier, and he lies there dead, and they try to find out who done it, and Rowena tells them what happened to Alicia, and I wasn't buying what she said either. Poirot finds out who did the murder, and he sees Maxime in the photo, and he now believes he knows who killed Alicia, Mrs. Reynolds, and Dr. Ferrier, as it happens to be Rowena. Like I brought up before, it was that damn obvious, as she killed Alicia with the poison honey and with bees, and threw her out pretending it was suicide. And how she kills Mrs. Reynolds, she pushed her to death, and while she tried to kill Poirot, and she changed the time on the clock, and Dr. Ferrier was killed, but by not doing what she told him to do, and stabbed himself. And Rowena runs, and Poirot does catch up to her, and she turns around and sees Alicia, and puts her to her death by dragging her in the water. And everyone leaves as the case is solved. And Leopold goes with Olga to St. Louis, Missouri, with Desdemona and Nicholas joining them as they go home. And everyone goes on the boat in their own separate ways, like Oliver writing one book about the adventures of Hercule Poirot. And Poirot comes back and helps the man who refused to see her earlier and decides to take care of his case after all. And the credits roll to the climax was what I expected, but a little less satisfying, as I unfortunately wasn't satisfied. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 4.6 out of 10. The shots looked funny, as Kenneth Branagh as a director has done that before in Thor, and it was annoying in that film, but it's more annoying in this film. And honestly, Michelle Yeoh is the best performance in the movie, in my opinion. And that's how little I care for the characters. And why is Tina Fey in this movie? I don't know, as she's a comedian. The movie isn't good nor scary as another PG-13 rated horror movie called The Quiet Place. And the dialogue I couldn't buy at times, and I knew had to be a way to expose Rowena. And at the beginning of the movie, it was told by saying either mother or writing M, which made it super obvious, and I caught that in my second viewing, as it was obvious it was not funny. This is perhaps the worst of the Kenneth Branagh Hercule Poirot projects, as it tried to be a murder mystery mixed with in a blender with a horror movie, and it unfortunately didn't satisfy me, nor did it make me care. So I'm afraid I have to give this a mild non-recommendation. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and whenever they come up with another one, the case is solved.